The sharp tap of a pen against polished wood echoed through the silent office. James Calloway sat behind his massive glass desk, staring blankly at the email open on his laptop screen. The golden glow of the New York skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed. His mind was stuck in the past, on a name he hadn't thought about in years. Emma Park. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his neatly styled dark hair. The name shouldn't mean anything. It was just another person from high school, another face blurred into the background of a past life. Except it wasn't. His phone buzzed against the desk, and the name Ryan Delgado lit up the screen. James sighed, debating whether to ignore it, but he already knew Ryan wouldn't stop. Pressing accept, he leaned back in his chair. This is a bad idea. Ryan's voice crackled through the speaker. Come on, James. It's just one night. And you owe me. James scoffed. I don't owe you anything. Really? Ryan's tone carried amusement. Because I distinctly remember a certain physics final in senior year. I kept my mouth shut when you copied half my test. James rubbed his temple. That was 15 years ago, Ryan. And yet, here we are. Besides, it's not just about that. This is about doing the right thing. A dry chuckle escaped James. The right thing? Asking a woman I barely knew in high school to a charity gala disguised as a reunion. That sounds more like your idea of entertainment. Ryan sighed. Look, you and I both know high school wasn't great for her, and we didn't make it any better. No, you weren't one of the jerks who bullied her, but you were indifferent. James finished the sentence. Silence stretched between them. James pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling an unfamiliar twinge of guilt. Indifference was a word he never liked being associated with, yet it fit. All I'm saying, Ryan continued, is that maybe it's time to change that. Maybe give her the night she should have had back then. James sighed. You think she'd even say yes? You won't know unless you ask. Scrolling back up, James hesitated before clicking on the alumni database link Ryan had sent earlier. His jaw tightened when he found Emma's name. Dr. Emma Park, pediatric reconstructive surgeon, Chicago Children's Hospital, a successful, highly regarded doctor, not the girl they remembered. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What the hell was he even supposed to say? Hey, Emma, remember me? I'm the guy who didn't make your life miserable, but also didn't do anything to stop the ones who did. Want to relive high school for a night? Yeah, that would go over great. Shaking his head, James started typing. Emma, Ryan suggested I reach out about the upcoming alumni gala. I know it's been years, but I thought it might be interesting to catch up. Would you consider attending with me? He read it back twice, then deleted it. Too formal, too transactional. Trying again, he typed, Hey Emma, I hope this email doesn't come out of nowhere. Ryan talked me into reaching out, and I'll admit this is probably strange. But if you're attending the alumni gala, would you consider going with me? No expectations, just two people seeing how much we've changed. Let me know what you think. James. He hesitated, finger hovering over the send button. Then, before he could overthink it, he hit send and shut his laptop. James didn't expect an immediate reply, which is why, 20 minutes later, when his phone vibrated with a new email notification, his breath caught in his throat. James hesitated before unlocking his phone. His pulse ticked slightly faster than he liked, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar deals without blinking. But this wasn't a business transaction. It was something more unpredictable. Emma Park, new message. He exhaled sharply and tapped to open it. James, this is unexpected. I don't typically attend alumni events, and to be honest, high school wasn't exactly a place of fond memories for me. However, if you're serious about this, I have one condition. I'll go, but I'll be wearing a masquerade mask all evening. No one will see my face until I choose to remove it. If that's too strange for you, I understand. Emma. James blinked. His first instinct was confusion. His second was intrigue. A mask. He wasn't sure what reaction he had anticipated. Outright rejection, maybe a polite excuse. But this? This was something else. He could have ignored the email, pretended he never saw it. But that wasn't an option. Not when curiosity had already started to settle in, gnawing at the back of his mind. Why a mask? What was she hiding? Or was it about control? About making sure this night happened on her terms? A smirk ghosted his lips. Clever. Before he could talk himself out of it, he started typing. Emma, interesting condition. I have to admit I didn't expect that, but I respect it. If that's what it takes for you to attend, I have no complaints. Let me know what you need on my end. James. He hit send. No second guessing this time. As he set his phone down, he glanced at the city skyline again, but for the first time in years, his mind wasn't on the next business deal or investor meeting. Somewhere across the country, a woman he barely knew anymore had just agreed to attend an event with him. Not because of nostalgia or old friendships, but because she had something to prove. James wasn't sure why, but he had a feeling this night would be more than just a reunion. It would be a reckoning, and he wasn't entirely sure if he was ready for it. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filled the sterile air of the operating room. Dr. Emma Park barely noticed it. Her focus was entirely on the delicate sutures she was threading, her hands steady despite the exhaustion pressing against her temples. The tiny patient on the table, a 6-year-old girl named Emily Crawford, had suffered extensive facial trauma in a car accident. A year ago, reconstructing a case this complex would have made her nervous. Now it was muscle memory, precision, control. Blood pressure stable, the anesthesiologist reported. Emma nodded, making the final stitch before stepping back. Close up, she instructed, her voice calm, detached. One of the surgical residents took over as she peeled off her gloves and mask. Dr. Lisa Monroe, her mentor and closest confidant, gave her a knowing look as they scrubbed out. You didn't sleep last night, did you? Emma barely glanced at her. Didn't have time. Lisa let out a soft chuckle. Liar. This wouldn't have anything to do with an email from a certain James Calloway, would it? Emma stiffened slightly but kept washing her hands. Ryan must have told you. Lisa shrugged, drying her hands. He might have mentioned something when he called to check in on you. Said you agreed to go with James under some interesting conditions. Emma exhaled through her nose. The mask is non-negotiable. Lisa studied her for a moment, then leaned against the sink. Are you doing this for revenge? The question shouldn't have caught Emma off guard, but it did. No. She grabbed a paper towel and turned toward Lisa. I'm doing it for me. I don't owe them anything, least of all my face. Lisa's sharp gaze softened. You know, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've built an incredible career. You're respected, loved by your patients, the people who mattered in high school. They don't get a say in who you are anymore. Emma clenched her jaw. It's not about proving something to them. It's about proving it to myself. Lisa sighed but didn't push further. Well, for what it's worth, I think you'll make quite an impression, and I think James might be in for more than he bargained for. Emma smirked. Good. Her phone buzzed as they left the scrub room. A new email. James Calloway. Emma. Understood. If you need anything for the night, just say the word. James. Short. Director. No unnecessary words. Emma typed back. James, I'll handle my own arrangements. I'll meet you at the gala entrance, 7 sharp. Emma. She hit send and locked her phone, a quiet exhale slipping past her lips. No turning back now. Lisa raised an eyebrow as she watched Emma slide her phone back into the pocket of her scrubs. "You're really doing this?" It wasn't a question, just a quiet observation laced with curiosity. Emma gave a slight shrug, her face betraying nothing. "I already said yes." Lisa folded her arms. "And you're sure this isn't about rubbing your success in their faces?" Emma let out a short laugh, one devoid of humor. "If I wanted to rub my success in their faces, I'd show up in a designer gown, a press team, and a feature article in Forbes." She shook her head. "No, Lisa, this isn't about them. This is about me walking into that room on my terms." Lisa studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then I hope you're prepared for what happens when the mask comes off." Emma didn't reply. She wasn't sure she had an answer. Instead, she threw herself back into work, spending the next several hours reviewing post-op charts and preparing for upcoming surgeries. It was easier to focus on her patients than on the growing unease settling in her chest. But by the time her shift ended, the weight of the impending gala pressed down on her like a slow-moving storm. That evening, as she walked toward her apartment, Emma's thoughts drifted. It had been years since she let herself dwell on high school, on the years she spent blending into the background, on the whispers and the taunts she pretended not to hear. She had spent so long moving forward, building something real, that she never stopped to look back. Until now. Until James Calloway and his damn email. Unlocking the door to her apartment, she kicked off her shoes and tossed her bag onto the counter. She moved through the familiar motions of making tea, but her mind was elsewhere. On James, on what he expected from this night, on what she expected. She had followed his career from a distance, though she would never admit it. It was hard not to hear about him. James Calloway, the self-made tech CEO, the man who built an empire before turning 35. He had power, money, influence. He had the kind of life most people envied. And yet, for all his success, she wondered if he ever truly changed, or if the boy who once walked the halls of Valley High without a care in the world was still lurking underneath. She had no illusions about what this gala meant. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no triumphant moment where she'd walk in, stunning and unrecognizable, and watch them all gasp in regret. That wasn't reality. People didn't change overnight. Some never changed at all. And the truth was, she didn't need their apologies, their recognition, or their validation. She had already built a life without them. But there was still a small, quiet part of her that wanted to step into that room and prove, to herself, that the past no longer had power over her, that she had left that girl behind for good. And maybe, just maybe, James Calloway wasn't the same person either. Taking a slow sip of her tea, Emma glanced at her phone. The email thread between her and James was still open, his last message staring back at her. 7 sharp, a deadline, a promise, one night to settle the past once and for all. James adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, staring at his reflection in the mirror of his penthouse bedroom. The tie had to be perfect, the jacket had to sit just right. Everything about his appearance needed to be polished, effortless. Control the narrative, control the outcome. That had been his philosophy in business, and now somehow it had bled into this strange arrangement with Emma Park. He still wasn't sure why he agreed to this. He wasn't the sentimental type, and he definitely wasn't the kind of man who dwelled on the past. But ever since he received her email, since she laid down that condition of hers, the mask, he hadn't been able to shake the feeling that he was walking into something he didn't quite understand. A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Ryan Delgado stood there, arms crossed, his usual smirk in place. "You look like a man heading to a business merger, not a date." James sighed, grabbing his watch from the dresser. "It's not a date." Ryan stepped inside uninvited, leaning against the doorframe. Right. Just a high school reunion with the one girl no one thought you'd ever be seen with. James shot him a warning look. You're enjoying this too much. Ryan shrugged. I'm just curious. Why'd she say yes? James hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? Emma had no reason to entertain this, let alone set conditions. Maybe she just wants to see if we've changed, Ryan scoffed. No, she wants to see if she's changed. You? She probably doesn't give a damn about. James didn't argue because deep down, he knew Ryan was probably right. He'd never been cruel to Emma in high school, but he had been indifferent, and in some ways, that was worse. He had let people like Wintergreen and her crowd do whatever they wanted, never intervening, never caring. The guilt he never acknowledged before now sat uncomfortably in his chest. Ryan checked his watch. Well, enjoy the night. I'll see you at the gala. He hesitated, then added, Don't screw this up, Calloway. James didn't reply as Ryan walked out. Instead, he grabbed his keys, exhaled, and headed out the door. The drive to the gala was smooth, his driver expertly navigating the streets of Manhattan. As they neared the Regency Grand Ballroom, James glanced at his watch. 6:57 p.m., 3 minutes until she was supposed to arrive. He wasn't sure why that mattered, but it did. Stepping out of the car, he adjusted his cuffs again, scanning the arriving guests. His heart wasn't supposed to race, but when a sleek black car pulled up to the entrance and a woman in a silver filigree mask stepped out, he felt a strange pull in his chest. Emma had arrived. James found himself momentarily frozen as he watched her step out of the car. The mask caught the golden glow of the entrance lights, intricate patterns of silver reflecting against her skin. She wore a deep midnight blue gown, elegant and understated, the fabric flowing effortlessly as she moved. Everything about her was composed, deliberate. Even through the mask, he could tell she held herself differently now. There was no hesitation, no shrinking into the background. This wasn't the Emma Park he remembered from high school. This was a woman who had built herself from the ground up, someone who no longer asked permission to take up space. And for the first time since this entire ordeal started, James felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite define. Admiration? Curiosity? Maybe something more dangerous. Emma's gaze met his as she approached, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't indifference either. "You're early?" she remarked, her voice even, unreadable. "You're on time," he countered smoothly, studying the way she held herself, poised but guarded. There was an air of detachment about her, like she was standing in the middle of a battlefield she had already won, simply waiting to see who would surrender first. She tilted her head slightly as if assessing him. "Let's get this over with, then." James extended his arm, and for a brief moment she hesitated. Just the slightest pause before she accepted, her fingers cool and light against his wrist. They walked together through the grand entrance, past alumni already buzzing with conversation and laughter, past the curious glances thrown their way. He could feel the shift in the air as they stepped inside, the murmur of voices lowering just a fraction, people turning, eyes lingering. The weight of recognition flickered across some faces, confusion on others. They were trying to place her, trying to remember if they had seen her before. Wintergreen, dressed in an emerald green gown that screamed wealth and privilege, narrowed her eyes slightly as she studied Emma. James felt Emma's grip tighten ever so slightly on his arm, so small a shift that he wouldn't have noticed if he weren't paying attention. Winter's gaze flicked to James, her smile easy but sharp around the edges. James Calloway. Still making headlines, I see. He kept his expression neutral. "Winter, still keeping tabs on me?" She laughed, a practiced sound. "You do make it difficult to ignore. And who?" she drawled, turning her attention fully to Emma. "Might this be?" Emma tilted her head slightly, the mask concealing all but the curve of her lips. "A guest," she said simply, her tone light but firm. Winter's brows lifted in amusement, her gaze lingering on the mask. "Mysterious. How very on-brand for you, James." Emma didn't flinch, didn't waver under Winter's scrutiny, and James felt something unexpected stir in his chest. He had walked into this night assuming Emma would be the one with something to prove. But now, standing beside her, he realized she didn't need to prove anything to them. They were the ones scrambling to keep up. Winter, for all her polished charm, was studying Emma too closely, searching for familiarity. James didn't like that look. He didn't like the game Winter was playing, subtle as it was. "Well, enjoy the evening," Winter finally said, her smirk lingering before she turned away. Emma exhaled quietly once she was gone. "That was fun," she muttered under her breath. But James caught the tension in her shoulders, the way she briefly closed her eyes as if centering herself. "You handled her well," he said. She glanced at him. "I've had practice." James wanted to ask what she meant by that, but she was already shifting her attention elsewhere, scanning the ballroom as if cataloguing every person in the room, every variable in play. He realized then that she wasn't just here to make an appearance. She was here to observe, to control how much they saw, when they saw it, and on whose terms. For the first time all night, James wondered if he had underestimated her. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the grand ballroom. Emma moved with practiced ease, her posture impeccable, her mask shielding her expression from the curious stares of former classmates trying to place her. James kept a steady pace beside her, his presence solid, but she was keenly aware of how many eyes followed them. Some held admiration, others suspicion, and a few carried the unmistakable edge of recognition trying to surface. She knew what they were thinking. Who is she? Why is she with him? Why the mask? She had expected the scrutiny. What she hadn't expected was how little it affected her. Maybe a decade ago she would have felt the weight of their judgments. But now, standing in the heart of the very world that once dismissed her, she felt nothing but control. They didn't know her. Not really. They never had. And the power of that knowledge settled something deep within her. James leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They're trying to figure you out." Emma's lips curved, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let them try." A waiter passed, and James plucked 2 glasses of champagne from the tray, handing one to her. She accepted it without hesitation, lifting it slightly in a silent toast before taking a measured sip. Across the room, Winter Green was still watching them, her curiosity veiled beneath layers of social grace. Emma could see the calculation in her gaze, the way her fingers curled around the stem of her glass just a little too tightly. Winter didn't like unanswered questions. She never had. And Emma? She had just become the biggest question in the room. James must have caught it too, because he exhaled a quiet chuckle. "She's dying to know who you are." Emma tilted her head slightly. "I know." The music shifted, a slow, melodic rhythm threading through the air as couples began moving toward the dance floor. James turned to her, extending a hand, his expression unreadable. "Dance with me." Emma hesitated for only a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. He led her toward the dance floor, his grip firm but never forceful. As they moved, she let muscle memory take over, the familiarity of waltzing both foreign and instinctive all at once. James studied her as they glided across the polished floor, his voice quiet but edged with curiosity. "Tell me something. What's your end game tonight?" Emma met his gaze evenly. "What makes you think I have one?" He smirked slightly. "Because I know when someone's playing a long game. And I think you've been planning this night for a while." She didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch between them as she turned his words over in her mind. Then, in a voice softer than she intended, she said, "I just want to see what it feels like to stand in this room without being invisible." James didn't respond right away, but there was something in his expression, something almost contemplative. And then, just as smoothly, he shifted the conversation. "Well, you've definitely got their attention." Emma exhaled a quiet laugh, though there was no amusement in it. "Attention is easy to get. Respect is harder." James's grip on her waist tightened slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Then let's make sure they remember you." Emma didn't need James to make sure they remembered her. They already did, even if they didn't know it yet. She felt the weight of their stares as they moved across the dance floor, felt the tension rippling through the room like an undercurrent. Recognition was a slow burn. It started as curiosity, then unease, then something sharper. The realization that they should know her, that the pieces weren't quite fitting, that the mask was keeping them just out of reach of the answer. And she liked that. Liked the control of it. James, for all his composed charm, was watching her just as closely. His grip was steady, his movements effortlessly smooth, but there was an intensity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just dancing with her, he was trying to figure her out, trying to see her past the mask, past the practiced confidence. And for a brief moment she let herself wonder what he actually thought of her now, whether she was just another unexpected variable in his neatly ordered life or something else entirely. Then the song ended. James released her, but only barely. He kept her close for a second longer than necessary, as if debating saying something, but whatever thought had crossed his mind, he let it pass. Instead, he stepped back, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You just became the most interesting person in this room." Emma arched a brow beneath the mask. That was always the plan. Before James could respond, movement from the edge of the dance floor caught her eye. Winter was making her way toward them, her expression poised, unreadable. Emma felt her heartbeat slow, a strange calm settling over her. This was inevitable. Winter had never been the kind of person to leave a question unanswered, and right now Emma was the only question that mattered. Winter stopped just short of them, her gaze sweeping over Emma with something between amusement and scrutiny. "You dance well. You must have had a good teacher." Emma tilted her head slightly. "Or maybe I just learn quickly." Winter's lips curved, but her eyes sharpened. "And yet I don't think we've met before. At least not formally." James started to speak, but Emma beat him to it. "That depends. Do you usually remember the people you underestimate?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Winter's expression. Surprise, calculation, something else Emma couldn't quite place. Then it was gone, replaced by a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ah, a mystery then." She took a sip of her champagne, her gaze lingering. "I do enjoy a good reveal." Emma held her stare, unshaken. "Then I guess you'll just have to wait." Winter's smile widened, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "I suppose I will." Then, with one last glance at James, she turned and disappeared back into the crowd. Emma let out a slow breath. The game had started, and she intended to win. The gala continued in a seamless blend of elegance and tension, laughter and whispered speculation, threading through the air like an undercurrent. Emma could feel the weight of Winter's curiosity lingering even after she walked away, feel the unanswered questions settling over the room like a slow-burning fuse. It didn't matter. Winter would figure it out eventually, but by then, Emma would have already played the game on her terms. That was the only thing that mattered. James led her toward the bar, his expression unreadable, though she knew he had caught every nuance of her exchange with Winter. He ordered 2 drinks without asking what she wanted, and when the bartender slid a glass of whiskey in front of her, she smirked. Interesting choice. You assume I drink whiskey? James took a sip of his own. I assume you're not the type to order something delicate. Emma lifted the glass, let the scent of oak and smoke curl against her senses before taking a slow, measured sip. The burn was familiar, grounding. You assume a lot of things. James leaned against the bar, watching her carefully. Maybe, but I wasn't wrong. Emma exhaled a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Maybe you just know how to read people. His gaze didn't waver. I know how to read you. Something about the way he said it made her pause. He wasn't flirting. He wasn't playing a game. He was simply stating a fact, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. James Calloway, slumming it with masked women now. Emma turned slightly, her fingers tightening subtly around her glass. Lauren Becker, Winter's closest friend, stood beside them, perfectly put together in a crimson gown that screamed status. She wasn't as outwardly sharp as Winter, but her brand of cruelty had always been more insidious, more practiced. Emma remembered her well. James's jaw tightened slightly before his expression smoothed over. Lauren, good to see you still love hearing yourself talk. Lauren laughed, the sound light but calculated. Her gaze flickered toward Emma, assessing. And who might you be? Emma tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, uninterested. Someone enjoying a drink. Lauren smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mysterious. How very dramatic. She turned back to James. You do know how to pick them. Emma felt the sharp edge of old memories pressing against her, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. Instead, she lifted her glass in a slow toast. And yet, you're the one standing here, asking questions. Lauren's expression faltered just slightly before she recovered. Touché. James chuckled, but there was something in his gaze as he glanced at Emma. Something intrigued, something almost impressed. And that, more than anything, made Emma realize she wasn't just playing this game alone. James was playing it with her. And that changed everything. Lauren didn't leave immediately. Instead, she lingered, swirling the champagne in her glass with the kind of idle patience that suggested she was waiting for something. A reaction, a mistake, some small crack in Emma's carefully curated presence. But Emma had spent years perfecting the art of restraint, of masking her emotions behind precision and purpose. She wasn't the same girl Lauren used to dismiss in the hallways of Valley High. And she certainly wasn't going to let a woman like Lauren Becker dictate the tempo of this conversation. James must have sensed the silent standoff because he shifted slightly, his presence a subtle but unmistakable shield between them. Lauren, he said smoothly, his voice edged with the kind of detached politeness that barely concealed irritation. I'd love to catch up, but I think we both know this conversation isn't going anywhere interesting. Lauren's lips curved in a knowing smirk. You always did have a habit of walking away before things got fun. Her gaze flicked toward Emma one last time, something assessing, something calculating. Enjoy your night. I'm sure it'll be unforgettable. With that, she turned, her gown trailing behind her as she disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a faint trace of expensive perfume and unspoken challenges. Emma took another sip of whiskey, letting the burn settle before speaking. She's persistent. James exhaled, shaking his head. She's a shark, and she smells blood in the water. Emma's lips twitched slightly. And what exactly does she think she smells? James studied her for a moment, as if weighing how much he wanted to say. A mystery, and she hates not knowing the answer. Emma tilted her glass toward him slightly in silent agreement. Then I suppose I'll have to keep her guessing. James didn't reply immediately, but something flickered in his gaze. An almost imperceptible shift, like he was seeing her through a new lens. She wondered what exactly was going through his mind. But before she could dissect it further, a voice rang out from across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention for just a moment." The event host stood at the top of the grand staircase, microphone in hand, his presence commanding. The murmur of conversation quieted as guests turned toward him, the room shifting into something more expectant. Emma felt James shift slightly beside her, his posture tightening almost imperceptibly. And she knew without asking that whatever was about to happen next would set the stage for the rest of the night. The host smiled, his gaze sweeping over the gathered alumni. Tonight is not just about reconnecting with old friends, it's also about celebrating the achievements of some of the most remarkable individuals from our graduating classes. And of course, it wouldn't be a true reunion without a little nostalgia. Emma felt the first stirrings of unease curl in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. The host continued. And what better way to embrace the spirit of our high school years than with a little walk down memory lane? The massive projector screen behind him flickered to life, and as the first slideshow image appeared, Emma's entire body went still. It was a photo of Valley High's senior class, her senior class, and in the center of the image, caught mid-laugh, was the younger version of Winter Green, Lauren Becker, and the rest of their polished circle of influence. Emma barely breathed as the images began cycling, each one pulling pieces of the past into the present, each one a reminder of the girl she used to be. The girl they had made sure was nothing more than a background character in her own story. James must have felt the shift in her posture because he leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay steady. "I expected this. Doesn't make it any less irritating." The next slide appeared, and this time it wasn't just a group shot. It was her, a yearbook photo, one she had spent years trying to forget. One she had hoped would stay buried in the archives of a school that had never really seen her. The room had gone quiet. Not completely, but enough. Enough that she knew people were looking, comparing, connecting the dots. Winter, from across the ballroom, tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Emma lifted her glass to her lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. Let them look. Let them wonder. She wasn't that girl anymore, and tonight they were going to realize it. The slideshow continued, images fading in and out in a seamless, cruel cycle of nostalgia. Laughter rippled through the crowd at certain photos, inside jokes from years past, moments that had solidified friendships, memories that still carried weight for those who had clung to their high school glory days. But Emma barely heard any of it. She kept her expression unreadable, the stem of her champagne glass cool beneath her fingertips, her grip steady. She had expected some version of this, had told herself she wouldn't care. But seeing her own face appear on that screen, frozen in time, was something else entirely. It wasn't just the image that made her stomach tighten, it was the context. The photo had been from senior year, a poorly angled shot taken in the middle of the school's annual Most Likely To award ceremony. And next to her picture, in bold, mocking font, were the words she had spent years trying to erase from her memory. Most likely to stay invisible. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, wasn't malicious, but it didn't need to be. It was the worst kind of reaction. Passive amusement, like the title was nothing more than a quirky, harmless reminder of who she used to be. But Emma remembered what it had felt like. Sitting in that auditorium, her hands clenched in her lap, heat burning under her skin as classmates had chuckled and nodded as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. She had smiled back then, pretended to laugh along, because what else was she supposed to do? Now, years later, she wondered if any of them realized just how much weight those words had carried. Beside her, James went still. His grip on his glass tightened, his jaw locked in the kind of controlled anger that only someone trained in power could manage. His voice was low, edged with something sharp. "That's what they voted you?" Emma didn't look at him. "I told you, high school was fun." His gaze burned into her, but she kept her focus forward, watching as the slideshow transitioned back into safer images. Group shots, class trips, moments that meant nothing to her. The laughter in the room had already moved on, the moment absorbed into the larger nostalgia of the evening. No one else thought twice about it. No one else understood why it mattered. Except James. Emma finally turned to him, her expression as composed as ever. "Don't look at me like that." His eyes darkened. "Like what?" "Like you just realized something about me you should have noticed years ago." His silence was answer enough. Before he could say anything, before the weight of the moment could settle too heavily between them, she stepped away, slipping back into the crowd, into the noise and movement of the gala, putting distance between herself and whatever James Calloway thought he had just figured out about her. She had come here to control the narrative, and she refused to let herself become someone else's revelation. Not tonight. Not ever. Emma moved through the ballroom with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her expression unreadable behind the delicate silver mask. She refused to acknowledge the burning weight of James's stare following her across the room, refused to let herself care about the way his eyes had darkened with something dangerously close to understanding. She had spent years making sure no one looked at her that way. No one was allowed to unearth the parts of her she had buried. Not even him. The energy in the room had already shifted back to easy conversation and laughter, the slideshow now forgotten, absorbed into the larger spectacle of the night. No one else had lingered on that image the way she had. No one else had felt the sharp sting of a past that refused to stay buried. And yet, despite herself, despite everything, she could still hear it. That quiet, dismissive laughter, that unspoken agreement that she had been nothing more than an afterthought. Winter Green was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a small circle of alumni, exuding the same effortless confidence she always had. Even now, years later, she commanded attention without trying. Emma wondered if Winter even remembered voting for that title, if she had laughed along with the others, or if it had simply been another fleeting moment in a high school career filled with casual cruelties. She felt James before she saw him, his presence settling beside her like an inevitability. He didn't say anything right away, didn't demand an explanation or push for a conversation she wasn't ready to have. Instead, he handed her another drink, whiskey, neat. She took it without question, the burn steadying something in her chest. After a beat, his voice came, quiet but firm. "You should let me take you away from here." Emma exhaled slowly, letting the suggestion settle between them before tilting her head slightly in his direction. "I don't need saving, James." His jaw tightened. "That's not what I said." She studied him for a moment, the sharp angles of his face, the tension in his posture, the way he held himself like a man used to fixing problems before they spiraled out of control. He didn't get it. Not yet. Maybe he never would. But for some reason, he wanted to. A slow smirk curved her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "If you want to help, dance with me again." James hesitated for only a second before offering his hand, his fingers warm against hers as she placed her palm in his. He led her back onto the dance floor, guiding her with ease, his movements steady, controlled. This time, she let herself feel it, the way his presence grounded her, the way the world narrowed down to the space between them, the way the past felt just a little farther away when she was in motion. And just like that, the laughter in her head finally started to fade. The music shifted, slowing into something softer, something that felt almost too intimate for the moment. Emma let James lead, let him dictate the pace of the dance, but she wasn't yielding. Not really. She met his gaze through the mask, steady, unshaken, daring him to say whatever had been lingering behind his carefully guarded expression since the slideshow. But he didn't speak. Not yet. He simply moved with her, as if waiting, as if trying to figure out how much of her silence was a test. She could feel the tension in his grip, the unspoken thoughts pressing against the space between them. He wasn't the same boy from high school, the one who had drifted through the hallways of Valley High without ever really noticing her. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous in his own way, because James Calloway was a man who noticed everything now, and she wasn't sure if she wanted that. After a beat, his voice came, low and measured. "Why did you really come tonight?" Emma's lips barely curved. "I told you. Curiosity." James didn't let her deflect. "That was part of it, but not all of it." She arched a brow, unbothered. "You think you know my motivations better than I do?" "I think you're not used to someone asking." The words struck something deeper than she expected, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly. "And what about you, James? Why did you ask me?" His grip on her waist tightened almost imperceptibly before he murmured, "Because I should have, a long time ago." Emma's pulse jumped despite herself. She had expected charm, deflection, something easier to brush aside, but there was nothing practiced about his answer, nothing calculated, just a quiet, matter-of-fact honesty she wasn't prepared for. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the moment. "Well, this is certainly interesting." Emma didn't have to turn to know who it was. Winter Green stood at the edge of the dance floor, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her gaze that made it clear she had been watching them for longer than a few seconds. The way she held herself, the way she studied Emma, it wasn't just idle curiosity anymore, it was recognition waiting to bloom. James straightened slightly, his grip on Emma's waist shifting in a way that felt instinctively protective, but Emma didn't need it. She wasn't afraid of Winter. Not anymore. Winter's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "James, I have to say, I didn't expect you to bring a mystery date to this little reunion of ours, and one with such a compelling presence." Her eyes flicked to Emma's mask. "Though I have to wonder what exactly she's hiding." Emma met her gaze without hesitation, letting the silence stretch long enough to become deliberate. Then, slowly, she let a small smile curve her lips. "Maybe I just like watching people wonder." Winter chuckled, but there was something sharper behind it. "Oh, I don't wonder. I remember faces, even the ones people think are forgettable." The words weren't direct, but they didn't have to be. The challenge was set. And Emma, she was more than ready to meet it. The moment stretched between them, thick with implication. Emma knew what Winter was doing, dangling recognition just out of reach, toying with the inevitable, waiting to see if Emma would flinch first. But she wouldn't. Not tonight. Instead, she let herself slow down, let her expression shift into something closer to amusement. If Winter wanted a game, she'd get one. "You remember faces?" Emma echoed, her voice smooth, deliberate. "That must be exhausting." Winter's smirk didn't waver, but Emma saw the flicker of something behind her gaze, something calculating. "It's useful," she replied. "Helps avoid unpleasant surprises." Emma tilted her head slightly, letting the mask catch the light. Or maybe it just makes you paranoid. James let out a quiet chuckle, but he didn't interrupt. He was watching, waiting to see how this would play out. And Emma knew what that meant. He trusted her to handle it, to stand her ground, to decide how much she wanted to reveal and when. Winter took a slow sip of champagne, her gaze never leaving Emma. It's funny, though, she mused. You feel familiar, like I should know you. She let the words linger, let them settle like a carefully placed hook. Maybe I just need a better look. Emma could feel the attention of the room shifting toward them, people subtly glancing over, picking up on the tension, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Winter knew how to work a crowd. She always had. And now she was setting the stage for a reveal she hadn't quite put together, but Emma knew it was coming. So she made a choice. She stepped forward, just a fraction, enough to shift the balance of power, enough to make Winter blink. You've spent the whole night trying to figure me out, she said lightly, like it was nothing more than idle conversation. And yet, you haven't even asked my name. Winter's lips parted slightly, just for a second, before she recovered. I suppose I assumed you'd offer it. Emma let her smile sharpen, let the tension stretch until it became something tangible. I suppose I prefer letting people work for it. A pause, a beat, a shift in the air that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. Then Winter exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. You're interesting. I'll give you that. Emma inclined her head, accepting it like a victory, because in some ways, it was. Winter hadn't won this round. If anything, she had just given Emma more control. James, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying enough finality to steer the conversation. If you'll excuse us, Winter, we were just about to get another drink. Winter's gaze lingered for a second longer, then she lifted her glass slightly. Of course, I wouldn't want to keep you. Emma didn't move until Winter turned and disappeared back into the crowd. Only then did she release a slow, measured breath. James leaned in, his voice low. She's getting close. Emma smirked, taking a slow sip of her drink. Let her. James arched a brow. You want her to figure it out? Emma glanced around the room at the people who still had no idea who she was, at the ones who were beginning to suspect, at the ones who had spent years making her small. Then she looked back at James, her voice calm, certain. I want her to realize too late. James led Emma away from the center of the ballroom, the weight of their last exchange with Winter still lingering between them. He didn't speak immediately, didn't push for answers, but Emma could tell he was turning over her words, trying to piece together exactly what she was planning. He was smart enough to know she wasn't just here for nostalgia or closure. She had come with a purpose. They stopped near the bar, away from the heaviest flow of guests, where the lighting was dimmer and the conversation more hushed. James ordered another drink without asking if she wanted one, and when the bartender slid a fresh glass of whiskey her way, she accepted it with a quiet smirk. You keep doing that, she said, taking a slow sip. James raised a brow. Doing what? Making assumptions. His lips quirked, but there was something serious in his gaze. I don't assume, Emma. I observe. She studied him, the way his grip tightened slightly around his glass, the subtle tension in his shoulders. He wasn't just making conversation. He was trying to understand her. And she wasn't sure if she liked that, or if it unsettled her. Maybe both. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the moment. I have to admit, I didn't see this coming. Emma turned just as Ryan Delgado stepped beside them, hands casually tucked in his pockets, his expression somewhere between amusement and curiosity. Unlike James, Ryan hadn't changed much since high school. He still had that easy charm, the kind that made people instinctively trust him, the kind that made him a natural at smoothing over tension. But Emma could see something else in his gaze. Recognition. James exhaled, shaking his head. "You're late." Ryan grinned. "I like to make an entrance." His attention shifted fully to Emma. "I have to ask, though, whose idea was this? Yours or his?" Emma took a slow sip of whiskey before answering. "Does it matter?" Ryan chuckled. "Depends on the goal." James cut in before Emma could respond. "She's playing the long game." Ryan's brows lifted, but he didn't look surprised. "Yeah, I figured." His gaze flicked toward the center of the room, where Winter was still engaged in conversation, though Emma knew she was waiting, watching. "She's close," Ryan murmured, "but she's missing one last piece." Emma tilted her head slightly. "Then let's make sure she gets it." James glanced at her, expression unreadable. "You sure?" Emma set her glass down with deliberate ease, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "I came here to be seen." She met James's gaze, steady and unshaken. "So let's give them a show." James held her gaze for a beat longer, as if trying to read between the lines of what she wasn't saying. But whatever he saw there must have been enough, because he didn't question her further. Instead, he exhaled slowly, set his own glass down beside hers, and offered his hand once again. This time, the gesture felt different. Not just a dance, not just an act. A deliberate move in the game they were playing. A game where Emma had already decided the ending. She placed her fingers lightly in his, letting him lead her back to the dance floor. The murmurs started almost immediately. Not loud enough to be obvious, but there. A ripple of curiosity, a spark of recognition that was slowly fanning into something more. This time, when they danced, there was no polite distance. James pulled her closer, his hand pressing firmly against the small of her back, his grip on her fingers secure, but never forceful. It was a silent statement, a quiet display of ownership, not in a possessive way, but in a way that told the room she wasn't invisible anymore. The music swelled around them, and for the first time that night, Emma let herself be fully present. Not just playing a role, not just proving a point, but feeling the weight of the moment for exactly what it was. James's voice was low when he finally spoke. "They're watching." She smirked, tilting her head just slightly. "Good." His fingers tightened around hers, and for a brief second she thought he might say something else, something heavier, something real. But before he could, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere nearby broke the moment. Emma didn't have to look to know who it was. Winter Green stood a few feet away, frozen mid-step, her glass of champagne hovering just below her lips. But it wasn't the sight of Emma and James dancing that had done it. It was the realization finally crashing into place. Emma saw the exact second it happened, the widening of Winter's eyes, the sharp inhale, the way her grip on the glass tightened, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Because Winter wasn't just looking at a woman in a mask anymore. She was looking at someone she knew, someone she remembered. Emma turned slightly, meeting Winter's stare head-on, and this time she saw something new in the other woman's gaze. Not just curiosity, not just suspicion, genuine shock, genuine recognition. And for the first time, maybe even regret. The moment stretched between them, the music continuing around them like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Winter parted her lips, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. And Emma? Emma just smiled, slow, unapologetic, because Winter had finally figured it out. But it was too late. Winter's expression barely shifted, but Emma could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. Recognition, disbelief, a flicker of something dangerously close to regret. All of it played out in the span of seconds before she mastered herself, smoothing the edges of her shock into something measured. But it was too late. Emma had seen everything she needed to see. The room hadn't caught on yet. The whispers were still speculative, people still unsure if they should remember her or pretend they never knew her at all. But Winter knew. And that alone made this entire night worth it. James had felt the shift too. She could tell by the way his grip subtly adjusted at her waist, by the way his stance became just a little more protective. He wasn't a man who let many things surprise him, but he had not expected this moment to carry so much weight. Winter finally moved, stepping forward with the same poised confidence she had always carried. But there was something else now. Hesitation, caution. Emma had spent years learning how to read people, and right now Winter was recalculating, trying to decide if she should acknowledge the past or bury it beneath layers of polite indifference. Emma tilted her head slightly, waiting, giving Winter the choice. She wouldn't force it, wouldn't demand an apology, wouldn't play the part of the girl they had once ignored. That wasn't why she was here. Winter's lips parted, then closed again. Then finally she said, "Emma Park." The name landed between them like a carefully set trap, the weight of it undeniable. A few heads turned. Someone nearby stopped mid-sentence. The domino effect had begun. Emma let the silence stretch just a second longer than necessary before she spoke, her voice smooth, completely unshaken. "Winter Green." She lifted her glass slightly, her tone light but laced with meaning. "It's been a while." Winter blinked, just once. Then she smiled, slow and sharp. "It really has." There it was. The carefully measured response. Not shock, not embarrassment, not outright dismissal. Just enough acknowledgement to maintain control, but not enough to give anything away. Emma could feel James watching closely, reading between the lines of what was being said and what wasn't. Winter studied her for a beat longer, then exhaled a soft laugh. "I have to admit, I didn't see this coming. But I should have. You always were full of surprises." Emma arched a brow, her grip on her glass tightening just slightly. That was a lie. There had been no surprises in high school, no moments where Winter had expected more from her. But she didn't correct her. Instead, she just smiled. "I like to keep people on their toes." Winter nodded, swirling her drink idly. "And what exactly brings you here tonight?" Emma met her gaze without hesitation. "I was invited." Winter smirked, but there was something else in her eyes now, something closer to unease. She knew now that Emma hadn't come here to blend in. She had come here to be seen. And Winter? Winter had just handed her the moment on a silver platter. Winter recovered quickly, as she always did. The shift in her expression was subtle, the momentary flicker of unease smoothing into something more composed, more deliberate. She'd spent years perfecting the art of control, and Emma could see her slipping back into it now, recalibrating, trying to decide how to handle this unexpected disruption to the hierarchy she had once ruled so effortlessly. Emma let her process, let her mask whatever emotions had surfaced the moment recognition set in. But what Winter hadn't yet realized was that this wasn't her game anymore. The ripple effect had begun. Whispers spread, heads turned. People who hadn't thought twice about the woman in the mask were now looking again, searching for the girl they had once overlooked. The room hadn't caught up yet, but it would, and when it did, there would be no going back. Winter's smile was carefully measured as she took a sip of her champagne. "So, Emma," she mused, as if testing the weight of the name on her tongue, "what exactly have you been up to all these years?" It was a loaded question, a subtle reminder of who she used to be, of the years she had spent invisible to them all. Winter was trying to regain control of the conversation, trying to shape the narrative before it could slip through her fingers. But Emma had come prepared. She lifted her glass, taking a slow sip before answering. "Oh, you know, just keeping busy." She let the words settle for a beat before adding, "Chicago's been good to me." Winter's brow twitched. So small a reaction most people wouldn't have noticed. But Emma did. She saw exactly where her mind had gone. Chicago. The puzzle pieces were coming together now. Winter might not know the specifics yet, but she was already starting to suspect that Emma hadn't just disappeared after high school. She had built something. James, silent up until now, finally spoke, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "Emma's made quite a name for herself." Winter's gaze flicked between them, something unreadable passing through her expression. "Oh." Emma didn't break eye contact. She wasn't going to explain herself, wasn't going to list out her accomplishments like she needed validation. If Winter wanted answers, she could work for them. The air between them was stretching thin, the weight of old power dynamics being rewritten in real time. Winter was used to people offering her information. She wasn't used to being left guessing. Someone called her name from across the room, breaking the moment. Winter hesitated, then smiled, polite and distant. "Well, I suppose I'll see you around tonight?" Emma inclined her head slightly. "I'm sure you will." As Winter turned and disappeared back into the crowd, James exhaled a quiet chuckle, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "That was fun?" Emma smirked, watching Winter's retreating form. "She's not done yet." James glanced at her. "Number, but neither are you." Emma took another sip of whiskey, feeling the sharp burn settle in her chest. "No," she murmured, "I'm not." Emma could feel the shift happening around her, subtle but undeniable. The controlled curiosity that had followed her when she first arrived had evolved into something sharper, heavier. People were whispering now, glancing her way, their minds racing to connect the dots. She had gone from an anonymous mystery to someone worth figuring out. James stood beside her, his presence steady but unreadable. He hadn't said much since Winter walked away, but Emma knew he was paying attention to every move, every glance, every shift in the room's energy. He was a strategist at heart, someone who saw 3 steps ahead, even when the pieces were still falling into place. And tonight, whether he had intended to or not, he had positioned himself firmly on her side. A waiter passed by, and James grabbed another drink, handing it to her without looking. Emma accepted it, the weight of the glass grounding her. "You were right," he murmured after a moment. Emma took a slow sip. "About what?" "That she would recognize you too late." Emma smirked, tilting her head slightly. "And yet, she still thinks she can regain control." James exhaled a quiet chuckle, eyes scanning the crowd. "I think she's realizing that's not going to happen." Before Emma could respond, Ryan Delgado reappeared, his usual smirk firmly in place. "Well, that was interesting." Emma glanced at him over the rim of her glass. "I assume you enjoyed the show?" Ryan grinned. "Oh, immensely. But Winter isn't the only one paying attention now." He nodded toward the far side of the ballroom. Emma followed his gaze and found Lauren Becker watching them from across the room, her expression unreadable but intent. Unlike Winter, she hadn't approached, hadn't made any carefully orchestrated entrances or cutting remarks. Instead, she had been observing, waiting. Emma wasn't surprised. Lauren had always been the quieter one, the calculated one. Winter commanded attention, but Lauren understood power in a different way, by knowing where to apply pressure and when. James noticed her watching. "She's figuring it out," Emma nodded. "But she won't react the same way Winter did." Ryan hummed in agreement. "No, she won't. Lauren plays the long game." Emma took another sip of her drink, letting the anticipation settle. good. She wasn't done yet. Lauren Becker was about to realize exactly how much she had underestimated her. Lauren didn't make her move right away. She never did. Instead, she lingered at the edges of the ballroom, watching, listening, calculating. Unlike Winter, who thrived on attention, Lauren wielded her influence in quieter ways. She had always been the strategist, the one who knew where to place the knife without ever getting her hands dirty. And that made her more dangerous. Emma wasn't afraid of her, but she wasn't stupid enough to underestimate her either. James seemed to pick up on the unspoken tension as well. "She's going to come to you when she's ready," he murmured, his voice barely carrying over the hum of conversation. Emma nodded, already knowing he was right. Lauren wasn't impulsive like Winter. She wouldn't lash out, wouldn't cause a scene. She would wait until she was sure of her footing before she made a move. And that meant Emma had time. Ryan, standing on her other side, crossed his arms with an amused grin. "So, what's the play here? Are we waiting for her to crack, or are you going to speed things along?" Emma smirked slightly, but didn't answer, because Lauren was already making her move. She saw it before James and Ryan did, the way Lauren slowly worked her way through the room, strategically inserting herself into conversations, planting seeds of curiosity and doubt. Emma didn't have to hear the words to know what she was doing. She was positioning herself as the one with the answers, the one who could pull the final thread and unravel the mystery. Smart, very smart, but not smart enough. Emma took a slow sip of whiskey, feeling the weight of James's gaze on her as she made her decision. Then, without a word, she moved first. She didn't wait for Lauren to come to her. She didn't let her build the moment into something she could control. Emma was done letting them dictate the pace. She strode across the ballroom, weaving seamlessly through the clusters of alumni, her mask catching the warm glow of the chandeliers above. She could feel the shift around her as she moved, people turning, whispering, sensing that something was about to happen. By the time she reached Lauren, the other woman had already straightened slightly, her expression smooth, but her eyes watchful. She hadn't expected Emma to close the distance first. "Good." "Lauren," Emma said lightly, as if they were nothing more than old friends catching up after years apart. Lauren arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Emma." She tilted her head slightly, the barest hint of a smirk curving her lips. "Or should I say Dr. Park?" Emma didn't blink. "Oh? You've done your research?" Lauren let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Please, it didn't take much. A few well-placed questions, a little curiosity, and suddenly everyone's remembering the girl who was most likely to stay invisible." Emma held her gaze, unwavering. "And yet, here we are, you seeing me." Lauren didn't react, but Emma saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance, frustration. Emma had stolen the moment from her before she could control it, and she hated that. "Congratulations," Lauren said smoothly. "It seems you've had quite the transformation." Emma tilted her head, considering her. "Funny. You say that like you think I changed for you." Lauren's smirk faltered just a fraction. James appeared at Emma's side then, his presence quiet but deliberate, his gaze sharp. He wasn't interfering, wasn't speaking, but he was standing with her, and that, Emma knew, sent a very clear message. Lauren glanced at him before returning her focus to Emma. "I'm just curious," she mused, voice deceptively light. "You came here for a reason. So what is it? Closure? Revenge?" Emma exhaled a slow breath, then smiled, really smiled. "Neither. I came here because I wanted to, because I could." She leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping so only Lauren could hear. "And because I wanted to see the look on your face when you realized you had no power over me anymore." Lauren didn't flinch. She was too composed for that. But her fingers tightened subtly around the stem of her champagne glass. her body language betraying the one thing Emma had been waiting for. Lauren Becker didn't like being powerless. Emma stepped back, tilting her head in mock sympathy. It's unsettling, isn't it? The idea that someone you thought was beneath you isn't playing by your rules anymore. Lauren's lips pressed together just slightly before she let out a quiet, calculated laugh. Enjoy the night, Emma. She turned and walked away. Emma watched her go, exhaling slowly. Then James murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, "That felt good, didn't it?" Emma took another sip of whiskey, the burn grounding her. She turned to face him fully, meeting his gaze, letting herself fully absorb the weight of what had just happened. She had won. And it had nothing to do with revenge. It had everything to do with finally taking back control of her own story. Her lips curved slightly, voice soft but sure. "Yeah," she admitted. "It really did." The tension of the evening hadn't faded, but it had shifted. Emma could feel it in the air, a different kind of energy settling over the gala now. The curiosity, the whispers, the weight of recognition finally taking hold. It was all still there, but the power dynamic had changed. She wasn't just a mystery anymore. She was a revelation. She had played her hand perfectly. Winter had been too late. Lauren had been too slow. And now, for the first time in her life, Emma Park wasn't the girl people overlooked. She was the one they were trying to understand. James was still beside her, watching her with something unreadable in his gaze. He hadn't interfered when she confronted Lauren, hadn't tried to direct her next move, and that, more than anything, told her he respected what she had done tonight. Ryan reappeared, a drink in hand, looking thoroughly entertained. "I have to say, that was one of the most satisfying things I've seen in a while." Emma smirked, taking another sip of her whiskey. "Glad I could provide some entertainment." Ryan chuckled. "Oh, it was more than that. You changed something tonight. You know that, right?" Emma arched a brow. "Changed what?" James answered instead, his voice quiet but firm. "The way they see you, the way they see themselves." And that's when Emma finally let herself look around the room, really look. She saw it now, the way people were glancing at her with something between admiration and uncertainty, the way they were recalibrating their own memories, trying to reconcile who she was then with who she had become now. Emma exhaled slowly, setting her drink down. "Good." Ryan grinned, raising his glass. "Two transformations, then." Emma let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head as she lifted her glass to meet his. But before she could take another sip, her phone buzzed in her clutch. She didn't recognize the number, but something instinct told her to answer. Slipping away from James and Ryan, she pressed the phone to her ear. "Doctor," Park speaking. A pause, then a voice, one she immediately recognized. Dr. Lisa Monroe. "Emma, I know you're at your event, but I need you to listen." The tone of her mentor's voice had Emma going still. It was clipped, serious, urgent. "What is it?" she asked, already straightening, body shifting into doctor mode before she even realized it. Lisa exhaled. "It's Emily." The words hit Emma harder than she expected. Emily Crawford, her patient, her responsibility. "She had a complication," Lisa continued. "Not life-threatening, but serious enough that we need to make a decision. I wouldn't have called if it weren't important." Emma's mind was already working, already filtering through the possibilities. But one fact was clear above all else. She needed to leave. Now Emma's grip tightened around her phone as she turned away from the noise of the ballroom, the pulse of the evening fading into a distant hum. "What kind of complication?" she asked, her voice sharp, precise, all traces of the evening's mind games falling away in an instant. Lisa's tone remained calm, but there was a weight behind her words. Post-op swelling spiked unexpectedly. It was manageable at first, but it's pressing against her airway. We've had her on close monitoring, but her oxygen levels dipped. We're debating whether to intervene now or hold off to see if the swelling stabilizes on its own. Emma's mind clicked into place, shifting through possibilities, weighing risks. She had performed Emily's surgery herself. Every stitch, every suture had been hers, her responsibility. She knew the girl's case better than anyone. How bad is the O2 drop? Lisa hesitated for a fraction of a second. She's hovering at 91%, but we had to slightly increase her oxygen flow. If it dips below 89, we have to act. A few more percentage points. That was all that separated stability from emergency. Emma was already moving. She turned on her heel, scanning the room for James, her pulse steady, but her mind already ahead of her body. She needed to get to the airport. Now she found him near the bar, deep in quiet conversation with Ryan. James must have sensed something was wrong before she even said a word, because as soon as she reached him, he straightened, his entire focus shifting to her. "I have to go," Emma said, slipping her phone back into her clutch. James studied her, his gaze flicking between her face and the tightness in her posture. "What happened?" "Emily." That was all she had to say. He understood immediately. James didn't hesitate. "I'll take you." Emma blinked, thrown off by how fast he reacted. "You don't have to." "I have my jet on standby." His voice was firm, not offering, but deciding. "We'll get there faster than any commercial flight. Let's go." Emma didn't argue. There wasn't time. Ryan, who had been listening silently, whistled lowly. "I'm guessing this isn't just a casual leave early situation." Emma shook her head. "It's medical." Ryan nodded, already moving to cover for them. "Go. I'll handle the questions." Emma didn't wait. Neither did James. They moved through the crowd with purpose, slipping past curious glances and hushed conversations. Emma didn't care who saw her leave or what conclusions they drew. Her world had already shifted. The gala, Winter, Lauren. It all felt distant now. They stepped outside into the cool Manhattan air, the city alive with movement, but Emma's focus was singular. James had already pulled out his phone, murmuring brief, efficient instructions to his pilot. Within minutes, they were in his car, the engine humming as the driver pulled into traffic, with the kind of urgency that only came with real power, real influence. Emma stared out the window, her mind racing through Emily's case, through the variables, through the decisions she might have to make before the night was over. Then James spoke, pulling her out of her thoughts. "She's going to be okay, isn't she?" Emma didn't answer immediately, because she didn't make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she exhaled, pressing her fingers lightly against her temple. "She's strong." James studied her for a moment. "So are you." Emma didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the weight of his words. Instead, she just watched the skyline blur past, knowing that by the time the sun rose, everything would be different. The hum of the private jet was steady, almost soothing, but Emma couldn't focus on anything except the medical reports Lisa had forwarded to her phone. Emily's oxygen levels had stabilized for now, but it was still a fragile balance. The girl was young, resilient, but post-op complications could turn quickly, and Emma wasn't willing to take that chance. She barely registered the luxury of the cabin, the sleek leather seats, the glass of water James had set beside her without a word. He hadn't spoken much since they boarded, letting her work, letting her be what she needed to be in this moment. Dr. Park, not Emma from high school. And she appreciated that more than she could say. Her fingers hovered over the screen, running through potential treatment options, scanning the latest vitals Lisa had sent. Then James finally broke the silence. "We'll land in just under an hour. A car will be waiting." Emma glanced up briefly. He was sitting across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, focused, always assessing, always planning. She exhaled, setting her phone down. "You didn't have to do this." James leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "Didn't I?" Emma frowned, but he continued before she could respond. "You think this is about obligation, about some residual guilt from high school?" He shook his head, his gaze steady. "It's not. I'm here because I want to be." Emma held his stare, searching for any trace of pity, but there was none, only conviction. And that unsettled her in a way she wasn't ready to unpack. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're used to fixing things, aren't you?" James smirked slightly, but there was something serious in his expression. "And you're used to not letting anyone help." Emma exhaled, shaking her head, but she didn't argue. Because he wasn't wrong. The rest of the flight passed in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like something unspoken had settled between them, something neither of them were ready to name. When they landed, Emma barely paused to acknowledge the car waiting on the tarmac. James had arranged everything seamlessly, of course. He always did. He was a man who made things happen. The ride to the hospital was fast, efficient. Emma's pulse picked up as they neared the familiar entrance, her mind already shifting back into full medical mode. She barely registered James following her inside, his presence solid but unobtrusive. Lisa was waiting for her just outside Emily's room, her expression unreadable. Emma didn't waste time. "What's the latest?" Lisa handed her a tablet with the most recent vitals. "She's holding steady. I still don't like the swelling, but we managed to keep her oxygen above 90. The next few hours are crucial." Emma nodded, already flipping through the data. "I want to see her." Lisa gestured toward the door. "Go. I'll update the rest of the team." Emma stepped inside, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Emily lay in the hospital bed, her tiny frame dwarfed by the blankets, an oxygen mask secured over her face. Her parents sat beside her, exhaustion clear in their eyes. But when Emma entered, they straightened, relief flickering across their faces. Dr. Park was here. Emma gave them a reassuring nod before moving to check Emily's stats. The numbers were stable. Not perfect, but stable. And for the first time in hours, she let out a quiet breath. She wasn't too late. Emma reached for Emily's small hand, her fingers gentle against the child's wrist as she counted her pulse, feeling the steady but fragile rhythm beneath her touch. The machines beeped softly around them, a constant reminder that every second mattered. But for now, Emily was holding on. She was strong, stronger than most adults Emma had treated. Her mother let out a shaky breath, her voice hoarse from hours of worry. "Is she going to be okay?" Emma met her gaze directly. "She's stable. That's a good sign. The next few hours are critical, but we've caught this in time." She kept her voice calm, unwavering, because she knew that hope, if not handled properly, could be dangerous. "We're going to monitor the swelling closely. If it doesn't go down naturally, we'll take the next step." Emily's father nodded, his hands clenching together in his lap. "And if it gets worse?" Emma didn't hesitate. "Then I'll fix it." The words weren't an empty promise. They weren't meant to comfort. They were simply the truth, because that's what Emma Park did. She fixed what was broken. She rebuilt what others thought was beyond repair. She wasn't that girl in the yearbook anymore, the one they had deemed forgettable, invisible. Now she was the person people turned to when the stakes were at their highest. A soft, weak voice broke through the moment. "Doctor? Park?" Emma's head snapped down, her pulse jumping. Emily's eyelids fluttered open, hazy but searching. Her small fingers curled slightly in Emma's grasp. Emma's throat tightened, but she didn't let the emotion show. She simply squeezed Emily's hand, her voice soft but strong. "I'm here." Emily blinked slowly. Did I miss story time?" A small, unexpected smile pulled at the corner of Emma's lips. This kid. Even now, after everything, she was worried about story time. Emma shook her head. "Nope. You're right on time." Emily made a tiny noise of approval before her eyelids grew heavy again, slipping back into rest. Emma took a deep breath, finally letting some of the tension leave her body. She turned back to Lisa, who had been watching silently from the doorway. Lisa's eyes were knowing. "You did good, Emma." Emma let out a slow exhale, nodding. "We're not done yet." Lisa chuckled softly. "No, but this part?" "This part you won." Emma wasn't sure why those words hit her the way they did. Maybe because winning had never been something she associated with herself. For so long, she had been clawing her way forward, proving herself, pushing against the weight of what people had once expected of her. But tonight, standing here, with Emily breathing steadily beside her, with James Calloway watching from just beyond the doorway, she finally understood. She hadn't come to the gala to win, she had already won. Because this was what mattered. Not the past, not the whispers, not the people who had failed to see her. She had built a life that had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with herself. Emma let out one final breath and let the last piece of her old self go. She turned, her gaze meeting James's. He had been standing silently, watching her work, watching her exist in a world where she was undeniable. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, Emma realized he had known she wasn't invisible long before she had. She stepped toward him, exhaling softly. "I think I'm finally ready to leave high school behind." James smiled, slow and certain. "About time." Emma glanced back at Emily one last time, then at Lisa, then at the life she had built with her own hands. Then she walked out, leaving the past exactly where it belonged.